absolutely important for us and for all of our viewers wherever they are. We would now introduce our second guest, our alumni, L. Michelle Smith. And I would tell you a little bit about L. Michelle Smith before I hand this over to for her to be interviewed, or for us to have what we will call a heightened conversation with her, right? It's not an interview per se. L. Michelle Smith has 2 degrees from TCU, so she's a double graduate. She is the CEO and founder of No Silos Communication. It is a media and consulting company that blends talent development and strategic communication to develop high performing executive leaders with a specialty in women and women of color. She's an executive and personal coach at her private practice, NSC Coaching, and she's a go to executive coach for the Executive Leadership Council. Elle Michelle is the author of the award winning and best selling book, No Thanks 7 Ways to Say, I'll Just Include Myself, a guide to rockstar leadership for women of color in the workplace. She is also a creator, executive producer, and host of the Culture Soup podcast. Say hello, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Dr. George, and the other 2 Dr. Gs.
And I would hand it over to both of them, to starting with Dr. Greensward, to have begin this heightened conversation with you. Dr.
Thank
Greensward.
you.
Hello, Michelle Smith. Nice to see you again.
Dr. Greensward, it's so
Looking
good to see
fabulous as
you.
always.
Well, thank you. I didn't look very fabulous that day that I spoke to you because I ran across campus after lecturing in my senior seminar class. But I was so excited to sit with you.
And it was a very moving interview indeed. So for our audience, if you were to summarize, can it even be summarized? But how would you summarize your description of campus culture in the 1990s?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to be such a part of this moving and important work. And I applaud each and every one of you for doing it. So, life in the 90s was interesting because I look at the cultural context, and one of the things that was influencing Black students during that time was a show called A Different World. And it may seem a little bit odd that I would bring this up, but we were influenced by it. In fact, everyone on campus stopped everything on Thursday nights. There were no club meetings, nothing, to watch Cosby in A Different World. I say that because during that time, the actors were wearing T-shirts like Free South Africa, or you would see them actually address race and other topics on the show. And it really was inspiring to us. And there were some other things going on in other parts of the country, like in Atlanta, where there was a man that was dragged. And we had friends at Morehouse and Spelman who had hit the streets and protested. And we were looking at what we could do right here at TCU, even though there were 3% of us on campus, to make a change. And one thing that I did during that time was actually write for the Skiff. I had a column that it was published every Thursday. And during that time frame, I would talk about race. And it was touchy. I had very, very supportive faculty, that's for sure, that were very vocal. And many of the students were supportive, but the most vocal ones were not. So it was tense in some ways. In other ways, it was not. It felt like family. But because there were just 3% of us compared to the rest of the population, and you had some segregation going on when it came to the athletes who had a totally different schedule and such. The football team had to be at the training table at dinner. They couldn't eat with us. We felt isolated in some cases. So we had good family relationships with one another, but there weren't a lot of us. So when we did speak up, it was shocking to some.
But, just to build upon that, and by the way, it's good to see you, right?
Good to see you too.
Absolutely. But why though? Why did you continue to speak up despite the fact that on paper you're outnumbered, you're isolated? Because what's so fascinating is teaching at a predominantly white institution. I'll have classes that are mostly white students, and they'll tell me that they're reluctant to participate because they're, quote, afraid to say the wrong thing.
Right.
Right. And here they are, part of the quote unquote majority. Right.
Right.
So what do you think factored for this fortitude or temerity of character, the strength to be able to speak up on a consistent basis about something that maybe wasn't as popular then as maybe it is now?
I think several of us just didn't know any better. We didn't know to be afraid. And just me personally, when I was 4 years old, my parents quoted a scripture to me, and I always remembered it. I could do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So if something needed to be said, I was going to say it. And if I got backlash, well, everybody's not going to like what you have to say. But I would say that it was interesting coming from a high school that was almost the opposite of TCU. I went to a tiny Christian academy called Tyler Street Christian Academy, which was very Black, brown, white, Asian. It was everybody. And we say to this day, we were doing diversity before diversity was even a word. And we had interracial couples. Nobody blinked an eye going down the halls. And, people were hand in hand. We were a family. So to come to TCU was a little bit shocking to me to hear some of the boldness that some people had in having a problem with people who didn't look like them. So I think my reaction was probably just an instinct. It was my first reaction, and they gave me a pen and they allowed me to write for the skiff. So I wrote about it.
When you talk about different people and their reactions, I mean, we take it for granted now, but Dr. Martin Luther King holiday,
yes,
right, is equivalent to Christmas almost.
Yes.
You can look up sales and, just it's a good time and everyone reminisces about this man. But a lot of people kind of forget what made him famous, this idea that he was advocating against something.
Absolutely.
Right. And so speaking of which, you played a role, did you not, in terms of, that holiday being recognized? Can you walk us through the ups and downs and what
Sure.
you had to perhaps fight against or reconcile?
Sure. Back when I was on campus, the Black Student Association was called the Black Student Caucus. And there were so few of us that the president of the Gospel Word of Truth, which was the choir, I was a part of that too, was also the president of Black Student Caucus at the time, Shonda Jones, the Reverend Shonda Jones. She's a reverend now. And we would get together often and talk about different things that needed to change on campus. Well, one of the things that came to the surface was we didn't have MLK Day as a holiday, like a holiday that was on the school calendar that we could take off.
Wait, one more time. I mean, just so to make sure the listeners heard you properly.
Yes, in 1991 and 2.
So that was during our lifetime.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is still the 90s. Right. Yeah. How many years from MLK? Ages, right? 30 years. We didn't have MLK Day off, and we thought it was odd. So we tried to come up with an idea to see if we could get it. And we tossed around several ideas, and they just didn't seem like they would work. And one day I said, I know this is far-fetched, but I think that if we get their attention, we're going to have to get them in the pocketbook. And the one pocketbook I know about is over there at Amon Carter. It's the football team. And everybody looked at me like, what are you saying? I was like, what if they walked off the game? It was icy. Everybody was afraid. They were like, that's a little much. I was like, if we get the right players, the ones that have decision-making power and leadership, maybe they consider it. So we had a bit of a struggle just meeting up with the fellas because, again, they were on a totally different schedule than we were. When we were going to dinner, they were going to the training table somewhere else, and we never saw them. And then they go to practice. So we had to figure out how to, get them to the BSC meeting. And somehow we did. There were 2 that came, and they happened to be a couple of the leaders on the team. And I have to say, I give them credit for listening to us, but the minute we said we want y'all to walk off on a Saturday at the game, they were like, oh, no, no, no. What are you talking about? Like, we could never. And so I said, okay, well, think about this. What if you walked off a practice with the threat, and it could be a bluff to walk off on Saturday? And they said, well, and they walked over to a corner. They excused themselves. They had a whole conversation, and they came back to us and they said, you know, this is really scary. Do you want us to talk to Coach Wacker? And we said, no, 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 don't talk to the coach. Just start walking. That's all you have to say. Don't say a word. Just start walking. And the idea was they were going to walk from Amon Carter, and they were going to walk past Moncrief. At the time, that was the first thing you would see right off of Campus Drive, right?
Okay.
Or Stadium Drive.
Okay.
Moncrief was right there. And back then, Frog Fountain was right in front of Brown Lupton, which was the student center. And it was the very center, of course, of the campus. And there was a crest in the way the land was laid out, where you would see tops of heads before you would see feet. And if they were going to come over the hill, we would see the tops of their heads first. So the night came, and I remember it was a Thursday night because Cosmic in a Different World had finished up their season. So everybody had something, you know, a reason to come out and not miss the show. But we lined up the skiff and made sure that we had a photographer there. We had the Black Student Caucus members. We had sorority fraternity members there, and anybody who wanted to support. And we waited and we waited. And at first we thought, they probably chickened out. But soon enough, over the crest, over the horizon, the first head we saw was blonde and a little bit balding. And then we saw the players, and they were arm in arm, like they were going to sing "We Shall Overcome" with Coach Wacker. And they made it up the hill, and boy, we were cheering. We were cheering. The skiff runs up, gets a picture, and asked Coach Wacker, how did this happen? And he explained that the guys said that they had talked to the BSC, and they had this idea, but they were afraid to not share it with him. And when they did, he said, I'm with you guys. Now, Coach Wacker didn't win a lot of games, but he was a winner. And I understand that there were some adults that came behind us and did the behind the scenes negotiating to actually get it done. And the way it happened, the next MLK Day that came that very same semester, we got it off.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Wow.
That's
Spectacular.
Oh boy. When I see this, and I got to tell you, when y'all played the video, I teared up again. Sylvain knows that I was really emotional. This was cathartic to be able to tell these stories because no one had asked us.
Yeah. But the thing is, as you were telling the story, I received chills. I mean, the only thing missing from your narrative was like the crescendo classical music in the background,
Yes,
right?
yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
This sounds amazing. It
Ring
sounds
of
amazing.
Fire.
This is a true story.
Yes, that's what happened. And, you know, I give credit to all of the Black students that were there during that time. I mean, I couldn't have just done that by myself, and I had to be able to bring up the idea, and they had to be receptive. And we, you know, we gained some agreement around it. We aligned and we executed. And I look back at it and I have to ask the same question, Dr. G, what made us stand up and speak out and have these? Well, and it emboldened us too. We had some other things on the agenda that we wanted to take care of.
The thing is, what you're saying, they're so very powerful for all the students who are watching us in particular, is you remind us of the power students have.
Yes.
See, now in retrospect, in hindsight, it was of course the right thing to do. And if anything, why didn't you do it sooner? But at that time, there was a lot of stake.
Yes.
There was risk involved.
Mm-hmm.
You had to overcome that apprehension and fear. And how did you do it? By bonding together.
Yes.
That's
absolutely.
the powerful message. And so students have more power and influence than maybe perhaps what they take for granted. And I think your story reminds us that students are not just beholden to whatever administrators say or faculty. The idea is that they are very much a part of the campus community and can influence the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And one of the things that we've seen with oral history, because I've heard that story from several different angles.
Mm-hmm.
definitely you have the gift of storytelling. But I've heard different testimonies from different angle. And every time what comes up is that several attempts to make change on campus have occurred throughout TCU's history. But what was different about this one is that it came from just about all levels
Yes.
of the administration of student life. And nothing really of that size, of that magnitude has really happened since then, not with as quick a turnout. Let's
Sure.
put it that way. And the different people I've interviewed, including you, have said at the end, we made it happen, but it took so many of us.
Yes.
And it was exhausting.
Yes. Absolutely. But you know what? That was a lesson that I took into corporate America. We call it stakeholdering. You get everyone aligned, and you meet before the meeting, and you get everyone on board so that when the actual meeting happens, there's a good chance that it will come off the way you want it to. And so these are the lessons I learned at TCU.
Mm-hmm. But you teach at TCU now. So how do today's students reflect on those needed changes?
Well, it's interesting because I only pepper those scenarios in every once in a while. And I believe it was fall of 2022, the senior seminar class. They were going to have MLK Day off. Everybody knew it was coming. It's on the syllabus, right? We're going to skip it. And at some point I said, let me tell you a story about how that came to be. And I shared the story with them. A predominantly white class, a couple of Black students, a couple of Hispanic, maybe international students that were there, but they were a little taken aback that their professor had something to do with it.
History coming to life.
I've been having fun. I was just wondering whether is now a good time to bring in our final guest, just to make sure he doesn't miss the party here.
Yes,